Good morning, Connecting Point, and today we continue our series in the life of David, and we're in 1 Samuel chapter 20, which is, I guess for many people, is a familiar story of Jonathan and David, and but I'm choosing to call this chapter Choosing God's Way. And hopefully you'll make that connection as we cover this story today. But first, I want to start with a table talk, and I want you to consider this question: how do you go about making difficult choices? Okay, let's begin by reading. We'll read through the whole of chapter 20, but we'll take it section by section. So let's start with the first three verses, 1 Samuel 20, 1 to 3. Then David fled from Naioth of Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to kill me?" "Never," Jonathan replied. "You are not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything, great or small, without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? It isn't so." But David took an oath and said, "Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes, and he has said to himself, 'Jonathan must not know this, or he will be grieved.' Yet as surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, there is only a step between me and death." As we pick up the story of David, what we do know is that there has been attempts on David's life by Saul. And David's trying to make sense of this. And so when he goes to Jonathan, his question is, "What have I done to deserve this?" And Jonathan says, "I haven't heard anything about this." So now they have to sort it out and what is actually going on. And so to avoid Saul's determination to kill him, this is going to, cost David. There would be a price. David would have to abandon two of the most important relationships in his life. One is what's covered in this chapter, is his friendship with Jonathan, but also his marriage to Saul's daughter, Michal. And so with this in mind, you can see sort of the tension that David is experiencing. He knows that because of what has happened so far, that Saul is jealous and is trying to do away with David. But evidently he holds out hope in this text that the problem that he has with Saul could be resolved if it was a result of something David had done. Perhaps he could make amends and fix the situation, and therefore he would not have to give up things that are so precious to him. In the story we discover here that Saul had not consulted with Jonathan concerning David, so Jonathan found it hard to believe his father's intentions. Like, why would he want to do this? However, Saul had already attempted to kill David on more than one occasion. I think by this time it's 4 times. And David knew how tense the situation was. So with that in mind, let's pick up the story at verse 4. Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you want me to do, I'll do for you." So David said, "Look, tomorrow is the new moon feast, and I am supposed to dine with the king. But let me go and hide in the field until the evening of the day after tomorrow, and if your father misses me at all, tell him, 'David earnestly asked my permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for his whole clan.' If he says, 'Very well,' then your servant is safe. But if he loses his temper, you can be sure that he is determined to harm me. As for you, Show kindness to your servant, for you have brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father?" "Never," Jonathan said. "If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you?" David asked, "Who will tell me if your father answers harshly?" So, when we consider Jonathan in this, he also has much at stake in this scenario. His friendship with David, as well as possibly being alienated from his father. And also lurking in the background of this whole story is Jonathan's claim to the throne, to be the next king, being the son of King Saul. However, as the story unfolds, Jonathan clearly recognizes the change that is coming. So David comes up with a scheme to reveal Saul's true intentions toward him so that Jonathan can see it. David was to be absent from the festival dinners, the new moon feast, that he would be expected to attend. The purpose of this whole scheme was to provoke Saul, to get a reaction from King Saul. A positive response would mean David would be okay, he's safe. A negative or hostile response meant that Saul was determined to harm David. David also suggested that if Saul proved to be hostile, then perhaps Jonathan would kill David rather than hand him over to King Saul. And the idea being David thinking, if this is my fault and I've offended the throne, I've offended the royalty, then Jonathan, you just do it. Don't let me face the king. But Jonathan reacted very strongly against David's proposal. Rather than give in to his father the king, Jonathan would, out of loyalty to his friendship with David, he would inform David of Saul's intentions. Let's pick it up at verse 11. "Come," Jonathan said, "let's go out into the field." So they went there together. Then Jonathan said to David, "I swear by the Lord, the God of Israel, that I will surely sound out my father by this time the day after tomorrow. If he is favorably disposed toward you, will I not send you word and let you know? But if my father intends to harm you, may the Lord deal with Jonathan, be it ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away in peace. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father, but show me unfailing kindness, like the Lord's kindness, as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord call David's enemies to account." And Jonathan had David reaffirm his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. These verses reveal to us, the readers, the foundation of Jonathan's character. How is it that the person who is next in line to be king is able to set that aside in order to take on the responsibility of defying the current king and engineering the safety of the one who would become the king? There's a lot at stake here for Jonathan. And his response is couched in this series of oaths. So here we have a series of oaths or commitments before God and requests before God. Let's just go through these. In verse 12, Jonathan says, "I swear by the Lord." In other words, I'm covenanting with the Lord, the God of Israel. I swear by the God of Israel that he was going to carry out the plan and he would figure out what Saul's reaction was going to be. Then in verse 13, he says, "May the Lord deal with Jonathan," speaking of himself. He says, "May the Lord deal with me if I don't send you away in peace. If I'm not going to betray you, David. May the Lord," I'm saying that before the Lord. And also in verse 13, it's more of a a request to David, or a request for David, may the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. May the Lord be with you. And in 14 and 15 is the request, show me kindness like the Lord's kindness, so that I might not be killed. In other words, David, when you become king, like normally or commonly what happens if there's a dynasty taking over from another dynasty, then there would be a cleansing or an elimination of the previous dynasty from the kingdom. And so Jonathan's saying, if it comes to this, allow me to be spared, and he'll carry that through not just Jonathan himself, but his household, his descendants. I don't want to be killed if there's this big change taking place. Then prophetically he speaks of David. He says, the Lord will cut off every one of David's enemies, which is an interesting thing for him to say because his dad is one of those enemies. And then in verse 16 they talk about the covenant, a covenant before the Lord between the house of David and the house of Jonathan. That this commitment to one another would extend to the descendants and through the generations. And as a foreshadowing, we see this in 2 Samuel chapter 9, where we find the story of Jonathan's son Mephibosheth. It's a hard one to say. Mephibosheth, who was given by David a place at the royal table of the king. In other words, he lived with the royal family. He lived with David's family and was given a place there. And he was taken care of there. We'll cover that in a future sermon. But having looked at this, I want us to go to a discussion. And the table talk question goes like this. Have you ever had to set aside your own desires when making a decision to follow what you knew was God's will? And to follow that up, is it possible to get to a point in life where our desires consistently reflect God's desires? Take a few minutes and talk about that. Okay, we're back and we're going to pick up the story in verse 18. Then Jonathan said to David, tomorrow is the new moon feast. You will be missed because your seat will be empty. The day after tomorrow, toward evening, go to the place where you hid when this trouble began and wait by the stone Ezel. I will shoot 3 arrows to the side of it, as though I were shooting at a target. Then I will send a boy and say, go find the arrows. If I say to him, look, the arrows are on this side of you, bring them here, then come, because as surely as the Lord lives, you are safe, there is no danger. But if I say to the boy, look, the arrows are beyond you, then you must go, because the Lord has sent you away. And about the matter you and I discussed, remember, the Lord is witness between you and me forever. So David hid in the field, and when the new moon feast had come, the king sat down to eat. He sat in his customary place by the wall opposite Jonathan, and Abner sat next to Saul. But David's place was empty. Saul said nothing that day, for he thought something must have happened to David to make him ceremonially unclean. Surely he is unclean. But the next day, the 2nd day of the month, David's place was empty again. Then Saul said to his son Jonathan, why hasn't the son of Jesse come to the meal either yesterday or today? Jonathan answered, David earnestly asked me for permission to go to Bethlehem. He said, let me go, because our family is observing a sacrifice in the town, and my brother has ordered me to be there. If I have found favor in your eyes, let me get away to see my brothers. That is why he has not come to the king's table. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan. He said to him, you son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me, for he must die. Why should he be put to death? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger. On that second day of the feast he did not eat, because he was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. So here we have Jonathan carrying out the plan that David had put together. And as it is, it may have been explainable that David missed one meal. Saul says, well, he could be ceremonial unclean, which then would be enough to not allow him to eat at that meal. But when he missed the second meal, which did not have the same criteria of being ceremonially unclean, when he missed that meal, then this is what triggered Saul's anger. Saul became angry at Jonathan, and he distanced himself from his son by calling him a son of a perverse and rebellious woman, and of bringing shame to his mother. Saul's motivation is also made clear. He is trying to protect his dynasty. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, in verse 14, the prophet Samuel told Saul that his kingdom would not endure, and the Lord had already appointed someone else. So this is also kind of in the contextual background of all these events, is Saul understanding that he has not found favor with the Lord, and the prophet has told him it's not going to continue. Your kingdom is not going to continue. And yet he's trying hard to make it continue. And his plan evidently is that Jonathan would continue the kingdom. But in this, Jonathan defends David. But this only results in Saul hurling his spear at Jonathan, which is reminiscent of what had happened to David back in 1 Samuel 18. So let's pick it up in verse 35. In the morning, Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David. He had a small boy with him, and he said to the boy, "Run and find the arrows I shoot." As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. And when the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called out after him, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" Then he shouted, "Hurry, go quickly, don't stop." The boy picked up the arrow and returned to his master. The boy knew nothing about all this, only Jonathan and David knew. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and said, "Go, carry them back to town." After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to town. So when David comes to meet Jonathan in person here, he already knows the outcome because of the exchange between Jonathan and the boy about going to fetch the arrow. And so what we have here in this text is the farewell scene between 2 great friends, Jonathan and David. The kiss in their culture was a common expression of farewell, with the expectation that you may never ever see that person again. And the weeping showed the depth of grieving that David and Jonathan experienced. But before they part, they recognize their friendship and commitment being not just between them, but also extending to their descendants. And all this is done in the name of the Lord. This story is a story of significant transition and renewal for the nation of Israel. In the context of the story, we see in this account the effect of God's plan on certain individuals. In other words, God has this overarching story that's going on, but we see in his grander plan how it affects individuals. God is constantly in the business of change and bringing renewal to our lives and circumstances. And so what we see in these individuals in this story is the various responses. And so here we see in this David story some key ways and key responses to learn from. Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann describes this chapter as an expose of the wrenching risk, pain, hurt, and hope required as God brings new rain. And as the future is presented in the form of David emerging as the future king, Saul's character is fully revealed, and he clearly sets himself against God's purpose. The new kingdom will come, but Saul will not be a part of it. Jonathan, however, is forced into a position of having to make difficult decisions, and he chose loyalty to David over his own father and over his own future. This isn't in anticipation for us looking back. This is in anticipation of Luke chapter 14, verse 25 to 27, which reads, "Large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and turning to them, he said, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even their own life, such a person cannot be my disciple, and whoever does not carry their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple.'" What Jesus does here is provide perspective regarding the ultimate importance of relationship with God. The people that Jesus was talking to had been taught to honor their father and mother. But Jesus is saying, not if it demands disobedience or disloyalty to God. And I notice that Jesus says in this text, not just father and mother, but other family members, and even their own life, which we also see happen in Jonathan's case. We see this principle lived out between Jonathan and his father Saul when Jonathan chooses loyalty to David, even at great cost to himself. So what we see in Jonathan is one who rightly aligns himself with God's future or God's plan, and this is also our task. We must allow God's future for us influence how we interpret our present. So with that in mind, I'd like you to close with this table talk. How does anticipating God's future help you in your present life and growth as a disciple of Jesus? Take some time to think, maybe talk about that, and then take some time to pray. And we'll pick it up at chapter 21 next week.